In times past, a game of chess between grandmasters could be a long affair. These contests of intellect and will often stretched over 2 days. When evening came, the game would pause. The player whose turn it was would consider the board, weighing every possibility, every threat, and every opportunity. He would make a decision, but he would not move the piece. Instead, he would write his intended move on a small slip of paper. This paper was then sealed inside an envelope. The game was suspended until the morning, a moment of quiet before the next phase of battle. The player who had to wait, whose opponent had sealed the move, faced a long night. He and his coach could sit before an identical board. They would analyze the position from every angle. They could prepare for a bishop's diagonal threat. They could anticipate a knight's clever fork. They could map out a defense against a rook's advance. Every potential move was studied. Every counter-move was debated. The night was spent preparing for the known possibilities of the game, building a careful plan based on the rules and the opponent's history. Imagine the scene the next morning. The players return to the table. The arbiter opens the sealed envelope. The move is read aloud. It is not what was expected. It is not a move that was deeply analyzed during the long night of planning. A humble pawn, which had been marching slowly across the board, has reached the final rank. In that instant, it is transformed. The pawn has become a queen, the most powerful piece on the board. The careful plans of the knight, so logical and well-reasoned, are now useless. The entire strategic landscape has been redrawn by a single game-altering event. This story from the world of chess offers a powerful metaphor for a much larger stage. It illustrates how long-term strategies, no matter how carefully constructed, can be completely upended by a sudden and fundamental change in the game itself. For many decades, the world operated under a set of established rules. The United States, as a primary player, crafted a long-term strategy. This strategy was designed to manage global affairs and maintain a position of strength. It was a plan built on predictable moves and known players, a game where the rules seemed permanent and the outcome seemed assured. Well, the world was the chessboard, and Washington was the master player, thinking many moves ahead. After the Second World War, the United States embarked on a grand strategy. This was not a short-term plan, but a multi-generational effort to shape the world. The primary objective was to create a global system that favored American interests and values. This involved building strong alliances promoting a specific economic model containing any power that could challenge its leadership. The world was the chessboard, and Washington was the master player, thinking many moves ahead. The plan was patient, methodical, and executed with a clear sense of purpose over many decades. It was a strategy of shaping, not just reacting. The first major phase of this strategy focused on the Soviet Union. The Cold War was a long and complex struggle, fought not just with military power, but with economic pressure, political influence, and ideological competition. The United States built institutions like NATO to create a unified bloc. It used its economic strength to draw nations into its orbit. The goal was to contain Soviet influence, and ultimately to create conditions that would lead to its internal weakening. This was the central conflict of the late 20th century, and every move on the global board was made with this primary opponent in mind. The strategy was designed to be comprehensive. It involved nurturing allies in Europe, nurturing allies in Asia, making them dependent on American security, making them dependent on economic leadership. This had the effect of weakening them as potential independent rivals, even as it strengthened the collective Western bloc. The world was divided into spheres of influence, and the American plan was to slowly but surely expand its own. It was a game of attrition and position, designed to outlast and undermine its main adversary. Every piece on the board, from small nations to international organizations, was seen as part of this larger contest for global dominance. Eventually, this part of the plan succeeded. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was seen as the triumphant conclusion of this decades-long strategy. It appeared that the primary opponent had been removed from the board. The United States stood as the world's sole superpower. The grand strategy seemed to have worked perfectly. With its main rival gone, the next phase of the plan could begin, consolidating this unipolar moment and ensuring that no new challenger could ever rise to the same level. The game, it seemed, was won. But the board was about to change in ways no one had fully anticipated. With the Soviet Union gone, the grand strategy did not end. It simply entered a new phase. The new goal was to ensure that Russia, the successor to the Soviet Empire, would never again become a peer competitor. The plan was to continue a policy of containment, but in a new form. This involved expanding Western alliances, such as NATO, eastward, right up to the borders of Russia. It involved encouraging pro-Western governments in the states that were once part of the Soviet sphere of influence. Each move was designed to limit Russia's options, reduce its influence, and keep it in a permanently weakened state. One of the key battlegrounds in this new phase was Ukraine. The West actively supported political movements in Ukraine that sought to pull the country away from Russia and into the orbit of Europe and the United States. The goal was to turn Ukraine into a strategic buffer and, if possible, a strategic tool against Moscow. The plan was to create a dilemma for Russia, forcing it to react in ways that would further isolate it. The use of economic sanctions became a primary weapon, intended to cripple the Russian economy and weaken its government. This strategy was applied systematically across Russia's periphery. The collapse of Yugoslavia, for example, was managed in a way that broke up a traditional Russian ally and created smaller states more open to Western influence. In Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, political unrest and color revolutions were often encouraged or supported by Western interests. The objective was consistent: to chip away at Russia's traditional sphere of influence, to surround it with states aligned with the West, and to prevent the re-emergence of a strong, unified power bloc that could challenge American leadership in Europe and Central Asia. However, the plan did not proceed as smoothly as intended. While some efforts were successful, others met with strong resistance. Belarus remained firmly in Russia's camp. The conflict in Georgia in 2008 showed that Russia was willing to use military force to protect its interests. The sanctions imposed after the events in Ukraine in 2014 hurt the Russian economy, but they did not cause it to collapse. The endgame was proving more difficult than anticipated. The Russian piece was refusing to be checkmated. And then, a new, powerful piece began to move on the board, a piece whose role had been underestimated. The strategic landscape was shifting in unexpected ways. The long-term American strategy had a critical flaw. It was focused so intently on containing Russia that it did not fully account for the rise of another power. For years, China was viewed primarily as an economic partner, a place for manufacturing, a place for investment. It was seen as a developing nation, a pawn in the global economic game, not a strategic competitor. The assumption was that as China grew richer, it would become more like the West, integrating peacefully into the American-led order. This assumption was incorrect. China was playing its own long game, quietly growing its strength. When the West intensified its pressure on Russia, it expected Moscow to become isolated and weak. But the sealed move was about to be revealed. China stepped onto the stage not as a pawn, but as a queen. It provided Russia with a vital economic lifeline. As Western sanctions cut Russia off from European markets, China became a major buyer of Russian oil. China became a major buyer of Russian gas. It provided technology. It provided consumer goods. It provided diplomatic support. This partnership created a new economic bloc and a political bloc that could stand against Western pressure. The plan to isolate Russia had failed because it did not account for the rise of a powerful new ally. This new reality changed the entire balance of the game. Russia, with China's backing, was able to withstand the economic assault. It could continue to fund its military and maintain its political stability. The chessboard was no longer unipolar. It was now, at a minimum, bipolar, with a powerful Eurasian bloc challenging the Western alliance. China's move was a surprise, not because it was aggressive, but because it was decisive. It fundamentally altered the strategic calculation. Actions that seemed low risk when Russia was alone became high risk when Russia had a powerful friend. The United States and its allies found themselves in the position of the chess player who had planned all night for the wrong move. Their strategy was based on an old map of the world, but the board had changed. A pawn, nurtured by decades of economic growth, had reached the other side and become a queen. This new queen did not need to attack directly to change the game. Its mere presence on the board, its ability to support other pieces, was enough to shatter the old strategy and force a complete re-evaluation of the entire position. The same pattern of a changing game can be seen in another critical region, the Middle East. For decades, American strategy in this area has been consistent. The central goals were to secure the flow of oil, to protect the security of Israel, to prevent the rise of any regional power that could dominate the area, Iran, since its 1979 revolution, has been identified as the primary adversary. The United States has used a variety of tools to contain Iranian influence, including sanctions support for rival states' direct military intervention in Iraq, Syria. The plan was a slow, grinding process of encirclement and pressure. The strategy involved weakening Iran's allies, Syria, Hezbollah. It involved building a coalition of Arab states, united by their shared fear of Iranian power. The ultimate aim was to force a change in the Iranian regime, or to weaken it to the point where it was no longer a threat. Every move, from diplomatic agreements to covert operations, was part of this larger chess match. The United States was the dominant player, moving its pieces across the Middle Eastern board with a clear, long-term objective in mind. But here again, the unexpected queen changes the game. China's growing influence has reached the Middle East. China is now the largest trading partner for many countries in the region: Saudi Arabia, Iran. It has invested heavily in infrastructure energy projects. This economic power gives it significant political leverage. When the United States tries to isolate Iran, it finds that Iran has another powerful option. China can buy Iranian oil, provide investment, offer diplomatic cover. The American strategy of total isolation is no longer possible. This new dynamic creates a profound strategic dilemma for Washington. The old plan relied on the ability to exert overwhelming economic and political pressure, but that tool is now less effective. Furthermore, any direct military action against Iran now carries a much greater risk. An attack on Iran would threaten China's significant energy and economic interests in the region. It raises the possibility of a confrontation not just with Tehran, but with Beijing. This was never part of the original calculation. The central truth we must now face is that the old rules no longer apply, The world has changed in a fundamental way. The strategic framework that guided American foreign policy for more than 70 years was built for a different kind of world. It was a world where the United States held overwhelming economic power, military power, cultural power. It could write the rules of the game because it was the strongest player. It could execute long-term plans with a high degree of confidence because there was no other player strong enough to fundamentally change the game. That era is over. The rise of China is not just the emergence of a new great power. It is the arrival of a player with the strength to create its own rules and its own system. This is the pawn that became a queen. It changes the value of all the other pieces on the board. Alliances that were once solid are now being questioned. Economic tools that were once decisive are now being blunted. Military plans that were once feasible are now fraught with unacceptable risk. The very ground beneath the chessboard is shifting. The consequences of this new reality are profound. For the United States and its allies, it means that continuing to play by the old strategy is a recipe for failure. It is like continuing to attack with your knights and bishops when your opponent has a new queen that controls the board. The old moves will not only fail, but they will also create new dangers. Pushing too hard on Russia, or Iran for example, may only serve to drive them closer to China, strengthening the very bloc that challenges the old order. Insisting on a unipolar world when the reality is multipolar is a denial of the facts. This situation demands a radical shift in thinking. Leaders can no longer assume that American leadership is guaranteed or that its model is the only one available. They must recognize that the world now contains at least two major competing systems of power and influence. This is not a temporary disruption, it is a new and likely permanent feature of the 21st century. The first and most difficult step is to simply acknowledge this truth. The board has changed. The game is new, and a new strategy is urgently required. Clinging to the comfort of the old plan is the most dangerous move of all. To summarize the situation, we have arrived at a moment of profound transformation. A grand strategy, patiently executed over decades, has been upended. A single seismic event, a pawn has become a queen. The plan to contain and manage rivals was predicated on a world with one rule maker: Russia, Iran. The emergence of China as a global power of the first rank has rendered that assumption obsolete. The game has changed. The old plan is broken. The world must now find new moves. The first imperative is to see the board clearly. This requires intellectual honesty. Leaders in Washington, allied capitals, they must abandon the illusion that the old strategy can still work with minor adjustments. They must admit the unipolar moment has passed. A new era of great power competition is here. This is not an admission of defeat, but an acknowledgement of reality. It is the necessary starting point for developing any effective new strategy. To continue playing as if the queen is not on the board is to guarantee a loss. Second, new strategies must be developed. These strategies must be adapted to a multipolar world. They cannot be based on total dominance. They must aim for a new, stable balance of power. This will require new forms of diplomacy, new types of alliances, a new understanding of what constitutes victory. It may mean accepting spheres of influence. It may mean focusing on competition in some areas while seeking cooperation in others. The simple black and white morality of the old Cold War will not suffice in this more complex, multicolored world. In the end, the lesson from the chessboard is timeless. Surprise is the most powerful force in any contest of strategy. You can plan for every logical move, but you must also be prepared for the move that changes the game itself. For decades, the world played by familiar rules. Now, a new queen is on the board. The old rules are no longer enough. Learn the new game, invent new moves, have the courage to write the new rules. The future of global stability will be decided by those who can adapt to this new reality.